This time Stuck, and in this video we will be looking at the break with Rome. So the break with Rome was a major event in Henry VIII's rule, but also in English history. So first of all, we need to look at Sir Thomas More as Chancellor, and he was the man who took over from Thomas Wolsey. But despite being an able scholar, Sir Thomas More was a poor replacement for Thomas Wolsey as Lord Chancellor. However, beforehand he had quickly become a favourite of Henry VIII due to his books, and one of his books, which he wrote in 1516, was Utopia, and this was synonymous with his strong humanist beliefs. However, he was also fond of Catherine of Aragon, and this meant that he was concerned at her treatment when Henry VIII was looking for a divorce. Now, despite being critical of the Catholic Church, More was also a staunch Catholic, and he was intolerant of any reformers or heretics. He was therefore instrumental in the persecution of any reformers from 1528. Now, one of the significant differences between Wolsey and More was the fact that More was rigid on his religious principles, and now this would result in complications with his relationship with Henry and the slow progress on Henry's divorce. So Henry VIII was helped in his task to gain this divorce with some of the anti-clericalism in the country from Lollards and humanists as well. And during the 1520s, Henry VIII had opposed this reform, and he had even written his book in defence of the Seven Sacraments. Now, this meant that he had previously been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope. However, this started to change when Henry's dispute started to worsen with the Pope. And in 1528, William Tyndale had written a book called The Obedience of a Christian Man, and this stated that royal authority was supreme above any other power, and the king had authority from God. Now, at first this book had been banned in England. However, Anne Boleyn had brought over a copy from France, and it had come to Henry's attention as it showed that the king was more important than anything else. Now, other courtiers such as Thomas Cromwell, who will soon gain great significance in Henry VIII's reign, had also travelled around Europe and was aware of the religious changes elsewhere, like in Germany, for example. Now, in order to implement these reforms, Henry VIII had to wait for the death of Archbishop Wareham. Now, this would mean that he was able to appoint Archbishop Cranmer, who was sympathetic to religious reform. However, Henry did still fear a break from Rome, because this would mean that the Pope would have probably excommunicated him. And excommunication means that oaths of loyalty taken by the king's subjects no longer applied, and a rebellion could be sanctioned by the church. But still, Henry VIII and Cromwell did want to exploit the weaknesses in the church, and the fact that the church had become weaker did make Cromwell's task slightly easier. And the church had become weaker because it had previously been criticised by humanist scholars including Erasmus and Simon Fish. And in 1528, the church's claim to legal supremacy had been challenged by the lawyer Christopher St. Germain. And he stated that English law was superior to canon law, and canon law is the law from the church. Now, this prepared the way for a parliamentary attack on the church's power, which would be conducted by Thomas Cromwell. Now, Henry had also been supplied with more intellectual justifications from Collectanea Satis Copiosa, and these were a collection of historical documents which justified the king's divorce on legal and historical principles. And it stated that the king had always had secular and spiritual authority over the church. So with these justifications, both Henry VIII and soon Cromwell, when he came into power, pressurised the Pope and the clergy. And in 1529, Parliament were encouraged to voice their anti-clerical feelings. Now, this meant that Cromwell was able to start collecting a list of the church abuses. In 1530, there was a revival of the medieval law prémunire, and prémunire is the idea that people are acting in the ideas of a pope instead of the king. Now, this meant that the clergy were collectively accused of prémunire, and this started the attack on the clergy. The next year, the clergy were forced to acknowledge the king as the supreme head of the English church, and in January 1532, an act in conditional restraint of annates were passed despite opposition. And annates are a special tax paid by the clergy to Rome in their first year of office. And this act was a significant attack on the Pope's right over the clergy. In March 1532, Thomas Cromwell introduced a supplication against the ordinaries into the House of Commons, and this called upon the king to deal with the abuses and the corruption of the clergy. And in May 1532, Henry also demanded that the church must agree with a submission of the clergy. Now this gave Henry VIII the power of vetoing church laws and choosing bishops even if they weren't approved by Rome. Now ultimately this provoked the resignation of Sir Thomas More, who we will later find out in other videos was later executed, and Henry was able to appoint Thomas Cranmer as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this was in fact approved by the Pope. So the next thing which Henry did, which really stabilised his idea of getting this divorce, was actually marrying Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was the woman who forced the annulment issue when she agreed to have a sexual relationship with Henry VIII. And by becoming pregnant, it meant that Henry would have to take decisive action so that he would not have an illegitimate child. Now by December 1532, it was known that Anne was pregnant, and on the 25th of January 1533, the couple married in a secret ceremony. Now according to the Catholic Church, this marriage was seen as invalid. Nevertheless, the former marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon was annulled by Cranmer in May 1533, and Anne was crowned shortly afterwards. Now when she gave birth on the 7th of September 1533, this meant that the child was legitimate to English law. However, unfortunately for Henry VIII, it was a girl, and this girl was Elizabeth, later Elizabeth I. So between 1533 and 34, Cromwell passed a number of measures to achieve the break from Rome and establish royal supremacy. And the first one was the Act in Restraint of Appeals, and this act was passed in February 1533, soon after Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. And the preamble to the act stated that the monarch possessed an imperial jurisdiction. Now simply this meant official powers to make legislations without challenges from other powers. Now this was not subject to any other power. Now this meant that Catherine could not appeal to Rome for the case to be heard there, and the cases would be held in ecclesiastical courts in England. As a result, it was possible to draft the divorce quickly, and in May 1533, the court was convened under Thomas Cranmer. Now this time the same arguments were used, yet they were validated, and the marriage to Catherine was able to be annulled. So the Act of Succession was the next one, and this act was made in April 1534, and it declared that Henry's marriage to Catherine was void and the succession would be from the children to Anne. Now it also stated that to deny the validity of Anne's marriage could be considered as a treasonable offence, and an oath should be taken to affirm an individual's acceptance of the marriage. So the next one, which is one of the biggest acts passed, an extremely important one, is the Act of Supremacy. And the Act of Supremacy was passed on November 1534, and it acknowledged the king as the supreme head of the church. Now this effectively achieved the break from Rome, as the king was able to solely decide on the church's organisation, personnel and doctrines. Now the Act of Supremacy claimed that Henry VIII had always had the right to be the head of the church, but now he was simply taking it up. Now this meant that Parliament didn't have to give him the right, but instead they just had to recognise it. Now at first this didn't have many political implications because the Pope would have traditionally had little influence in England, because all over Europe monarchs were gaining more and more power over the Catholic Church. However, the large changes started to occur in 1536 when both doctrines were changed and there was the dissolution of the monasteries. So the Treason Act was also tightened in November 1534 so that treason could be committed by spoken word as well as the written word. So therefore, by describing the king as a heretic, a tyrant, or as a usurper of the crown, this was a treasonable act and it was punishable by death. Now, although this act seems extremely strict, the only real victims were high profile. For example, Sir Thomas More in July 1535, when he was executed for denying the royal supremacy. Now, the final act was the act annexing fruit and temps to the crown. And this act was also introduced in November of the same year, and it meant that annates paid by a bishop would now go to the crown instead of Rome. Now this increased the financial burden on the clergy, whilst also strengthening the royal supremacy. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you soon. Bye.